By his own account, he enjoyed his first 2 years as Pope, with one big exception. The only thing I would like, Francis told a Mexican TV interviewer, is to go out one day without being recognized for a pizza. But he doesn't think he'll be in the job for more than 5 years. It's like the psychology of the gambler who convinces himself he will lose so he won't be disappointed, Francis said, and if he wins, is happy.
Let's get to work. Our first guest is co-founder and former publisher of the ZENIT News Agency, a non-profit news agency that reports on the Catholic Church, James Mulford. And we're also joined by the veteran Vatican correspondent for Newsmax, Edward Pentin. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Good to be with you.
James, let me go ahead and start with you. The Pope basically says that it's likely to be brief, my time in the pontificate. I don't know, I guess he misses pizza, but then again, it certainly comes as something of a shock to a tremendous amount of Catholics around the world. Why make this discussion?
Well, it was an off the hand comment. I mean, you can take it and put it into context. Pope Francis is 78 years old. He wasn't saying that I'm going to do like Pope Benedict and step down next year. He doesn't have term limits or anything like that. But I think he was just saying that he's the person in charge and he's going to make the decision about himself, and that he wouldn't think twice if he thought himself incapacitated in any form to step down.
Do you think it really was offhand? Because quite frankly, this is a Pope who seems to do everything with a purpose. He doesn't seem to say much when he doesn't think 2, 3, 4, 5 times before he says something.
Well, I mean, it was a very, very long interview. I was watching it in the original Spanish, and he touched on so many different things. And I have to say that, within the context, he spoke much longer on other things. I think perhaps we're blowing it out of proportion, but also because we have in our mind the memory of Pope Benedict, of Pope John Paul, who's the first Pope John Paul. St. Pope John Paul, his pontificate was a quarter of a century. Pope Benedict was very brief. And if we think of John Paul I, it didn't even last a month. So I think it's normal to kind of come to conclusions. But I won't say the Pope was speaking tongue-in-cheek, but I think that he wasn't giving it quite as much as importance as we are.
What do you think, Edward? Is it maybe just we're overblowing this a little bit, but then again, on the other side of things, people say, well, maybe it's not bad if you start to put somebody into a rotation here. Maybe it's better to have a new Pope every few years. New thoughts, new ideas.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think he supports what Benedict did, and I think he sees that as an opening, if you like, to the future papacy. And I think he agrees that, with medicine as it is, that people can go on a long time and not have all their faculties there. And so, it might be the right thing to do to step down. But anyway, that's the way I think he feels. And I think he is sympathetic to Benedict, who he calls, funnily enough, an institution. He says he's sort of created an institution where the papacy can be resigned from, which I think is an interesting term. And he also uses the example of Bishop Emeriti, if you like. Up until the middle part of the last century, bishops they were served as bishops till they died. But that has changed now, so that they retire at 75 or 80. And so he says, it's just a natural progression that the Pope should do the same.
Edward, it's very interesting because this Pope always says, as I noted, some very interesting things, and you would listen to him now make this off-the-hand comment. I don't want to be conspiratorial or anything here, but is it possible that maybe the Holy Father doesn't sit well with a lot of people at the Vatican, and even they wouldn't mind if he just spent a few more years, and maybe they moved on and had somebody in there who speaks more along the line of what they would like to hear the Pope say out loud?
Well, I don't think that's the reason behind why he said that, he could be going for another 4 or 5 years. I think he genuinely feels that his time is limited. He is 78 after all, and so he wants to get a lot done in that time. But some people are reading into this and saying, well, his comments were calculated to galvanize, if you like, those who support his vision for reform, to make them think, well, our time is short, so let's move ahead. And also possibly to lull his opponents into a kind of apathy, to think that, well, his time isn't long, let's just sit it out and wait for the next Pope. But I don't know if that is his thinking. I think he genuinely is answering a straight answer to a straight question.
Might not actually be a bad idea there. As I said, maybe you get, maybe it's like a 4 or a 5 year like the president. You get elected and maybe then you move on. Who knows what they'll be doing at the Vatican. Stand by, gentlemen, if you would please, a couple of moments. We have a few more things to talk about when we come back. When we do return here on MidPoint, new word on evangelicals and the Republicans. And now groups such as these are viewed by the Vatican. We hear an awful lot here in America what they think their role is. How does the Vatican see them here? We'll talk about that and much more when we continue right here on MidPoint. Welcome back to MidPoint. Co-founder, former publisher of the ZENIT News Agency, Father James Mulford, and also veteran Vatican correspondent for Newsmax, Edward Pentin. Gentlemen, I want to just fall back a little bit on something we just touched on at the end of the last segment, but I thought it was rather interesting. Edward, I'm going to begin with you on this one. Might it not be a good idea, the church continually needing to change, continuing to need to find fresh ideas and bring in new people and bring in a younger generation? Might it almost be better if instead of being something for life, maybe the papacy was something that is 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, and maybe allow younger guys to get involved? What do you think?
There is a case for that, certainly, but I think it rather goes against the grain of the church and the sort of, the papacy isn't like a career. It's not like a political position. It's not like a career. It is a calling, if you like. And so that calling, for many Catholics, they believe that goes to the end of life, that calling, like a priest is a priest to the end of his days. And so that should be the same for the ministry of a pope. So there is an argument for that. But as Benedict has shown, that it is okay to resign. And he's kind of, it was the biggest reform, if you like, of his pontificate was to do that. But we just have to wait and see, really, and see how Francis sees this in the years ahead.
Father James, what do you think? Because certainly he pointed out that Pope Benedict's decision, and I quote the Pope here, says, an institutional door has been opened, at least is an interesting concept to think about.
Well, I agree. I agree with Ed in the sense that it is a possibility and it's always out there. And I think it's a door that Pope Benedict opened, a possibility, an institution, as Pope Francis has said. But I think also Ed is introducing the idea of a calling, whether it be a priestly calling or a calling to the pontificate as Pope. I think we try to interpret things or look at it, compare it to other institutions, political institutions, and we could confuse power with service in the sense that, some people or many people, especially outsiders of the Catholic Church, might look at the papacy as the man who has the power of the church. And I sometimes very seriously, but also jokingly say, well, he's just the Pope. I mean, even the Pope has limitations. There are things that the Pope can't change. So the idea, I think that what you're saying is looking for not the possibility, but almost, the desire of having term limits or something like that, is to look at the papacy. And I think Edward described it very well as a calling, but to look at it in a light that is not conducive to the reality, and it's more of power and not that of service, is what the papacy really is.
Father James, I'm going to stay with you here a couple of minutes we have left. Interesting story. The evangelicals here in America, they're trying to mobilize what they call an army for Republicans in 2016. Without being political here, though, but let me ask you, from your seat in the Vatican and watching from overseas, how does the Vatican view the evangelical movement here in the United States? Do they see it as a good thing, perhaps maybe sometimes going too far?
Well, honestly, I'd say this, Ed, in the sense you say, how does the Vatican see it? The Vatican leaves what the Vatican considers that a local problem. I mean, sure, you're looking at it from down in Miami. It's a huge national problem. But you have to remember that the United States is one of over 190 some countries. I think the Vatican has diplomatic relations with 187 of them. A few, I think 4 or 5 more than the United States. So the Vatican, as such, and Pope Francis and the offices in the Vatican, it's not that they're not keeping an eye on what's going on, but they delegate that to the local bishops, to the Bishops' Conference in the United States, and they usually they will never get down into particulars of looking, whether it be parties, whether it will be like you said, movements, or, whether it be evangelicals or others. And I think as most observers, Catholics and non-Catholics, would probably have seen over the years, is that the Catholic Church tends to come out on issues, whether it be issues of life, on immigration, on social justice and things like that, more than commenting on specific political realities or movements.
Ed, would you agree with that? It's more or less about what the Vatican sees and what the things are that need to be done in order to teach the religion and move the religion forward, and the politics that's something that gets thrown out on the side?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think the Vatican's lens, if you like, is a Catholic one rather than a political one, of course. So, strictly speaking, it never really gets involved in political minutiae, if you like. And so it always is worried, what it's concerned about, whether the issues are consonant with church teaching and how the church views issues related to human dignity in particular.
Well, the funny thing is, I was told one time by somebody who spent time in the Vatican, they said there's nothing quite as political as being around the Vatican. They said that's a political animal all in itself. Would you agree, Father James?
I see what you mean, but I think it's probably more Italian politics than anything else. If I may interject something.
Please, I got about 20 seconds. Go ahead.
Okay, after the comment you said, you made a comment saying that that perhaps the Catholic Church or the Vatican would kind of throw out politics and only focus on something religious. But what the fact of the matter is defending all of or talking about all of those different things like the family and values and immigration. They have very specific political consequences. So it's not like the Vatican is thinking we're not going to get involved. We're not going to talk about any of those things. The Vatican will talk about it. The Church will talk about it. And the local bishops talk about it. Not to say vote for this candidate, but to say these are issues that all politicians, should uphold and should defend.
Well placed. I'm glad you pointed that out as well. Father James Mulford, Ed Pentin, thanks so much for joining us, gentlemen, and enjoy a cup of cappuccino on us, if you will, please. MidPoint will continue.